Everybody present in the room is BlackBerry Representative John DeBoer. Welcome, Mr. DeBoer. International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, Tim McSorley. Welcome, Mr. McSorley. And online we have Mr. Nareed, Chairman of the Board, Slovenian Certified Ethical Hackers. So they are in order of, just in order of what I have, I'm going to call on Mr. Nareed first for 5 minutes, and then we'll move to the other two witnesses. As I indicated to the witnesses that are here, we're expecting guests around 10:15, so I don't know whether we'll have an hour or more than an hour, but we'll get started and see how this plays through. So with that, Mr. Nareed, you have 5 minutes, sir, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Good morning, and let me add that I am honored to be able to speak before you. I served my second term as chair of the board of Slovenian Ethical Hackers Foundation. Occasionally, I also collaborate with various parliamentarians and committees of NATO countries on diverse topics, from safety of electronic elections to critical infrastructure and so forth. I also serve as virtual chief information security officer for a Swiss fintech company and as chief information officer to US-based, women-owned, Ukrainian-owned defense and cyber defense company, where I try my utmost to empower these remarkable ladies who are heavily engaged in defending their country via cyber means and otherwise. Pertaining to that, if Mr. Chair would permit, I would take a few minutes of introductory remarks. Let me start by saying that usually I'm very diligent before each such engagement as is today's hearing, preparing meticulously the topics I would like to present, but that ever since I got acquainted with truly brave and relentless women that are in most part responsible for setting up one of the most formidable cyber armies in the world, without outside help or funding, and while under rocket attacks, I have kind of changed my perspective on what's important and fully embraced a new reality. I believe it's one thing to discuss cyber warfare from the comfort of your home or office, playing virtual cyber games such as NATO Lock Shields, and quite another when, as we had an example, one of our core team members couldn't get online because a rocket landed in his apartment, cutting internet cables, luckily not exploding. It's one thing having a good night's rest and quite another sleeping 2 to 3 hours a day, being awakened by air raid sirens and still continuing highly demanding intellectual work and repeating that day after day for over a year, because time is of the essence and your countrymen are dying. I believe it is of utmost importance to point that out because I'm quite familiar with various cyber warfare scenarios, but none of them take into account the aforementioned reality of working under such stressful conditions, where the only time you get to rest is actually when there's no electricity or internet connectivity. Having said that, we were recently present at a closed conference in DC on the topic of emerging technologies. And the audience was mostly composed of military and intelligence agencies from Five Eyes. And they asked us on how we are able to accomplish all that we have showcased. And my answer was quite simple. These ladies don't sleep. That's how you accomplish what they have done. And truth be told, it's them empowering me and not vice versa. Also, let me say that I regret that this hearing cannot be conducted in camera, as I believe is the term, because I wanted to share some of the accomplishments of the conducted cyber efforts that have surprised both the military and intelligence agencies that are present. And I also have critical information pertaining to security of all NATO countries that was acquired by cyber means. And I'm quite certain that the Western agencies don't have that information available. So I would appreciate if we could afterwards establish some secure communication channel with here present committee, whom me and my colleagues trust, not only because Canada was doing it and helping Ukraine while others were just talking, but also because we know from other experience that members of the committee are trustworthy. Now, as far as the real world experience goes, I would like to suggest a few starting points for discussions that we see an example of Ukrainian cyber warfare efforts. Most importantly, crowdsourced intelligence that is being utilized very efficiently, both in terms of ISR, that is in terms of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, especially with the Delta system that I'm sure that the members of the committee are familiar with. Next, crowdsource operations, where Ukraine has effectively engaged so-called IT army of over 100,000 IT specialists, conducting mostly information war campaigns, and has additionally a core team of 1,400 highly sophisticated hackers, not connected to any military or intel branch, but still coordinating operations with both, and has proven itself as a remarkable asset. And lastly, I would like to draw attention to the recent public exposure of the Vulcan files, which are already known to Western intelligence agencies. This incident, in essence, reinforces the warnings I've been expressing for years, including during my previous engagement with the committee on the subject of threat analysis for the Canadian Armed Forces.
Mr. Nareed, unfortunately, I have to interrupt you because the 5 minutes has passed. You bring a level of reality to this conversation that maybe has been missing up until now. So I thank you, and certainly there'll be opportunity to respond on directly to other members. So with that, I'm going to call on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to call on Mr. DeBoer and then Mr. McSorley. So 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On behalf of BlackBerry, I'm delighted to speak with committee members today. For over 35 years, BlackBerry has invented and built trusted security solutions that help keep people, governments, and communities safe and secure. Today, we are a global leader in cybersecurity software and services. We protect more than 500 million systems worldwide. Our customers include all G7 governments, NATO, 45 of the Fortune 100 companies, and 9 of the top 10 banks, just to name a few. Given that every aspect of our lives is intertwined with cyberspace, we must act proactively to decrease our cyber risks in Canada. This can be done by adopting technologies and approaches that are proven to prevent cyber attacks. Required, however, is a fundamental shift in our approach from the current reactive model to a proactive stance, from a focus on incident response to a prevention-first approach to cybersecurity. At an operational level, that means first, ensuring that we are equipped with the most advanced AI-driven cybersecurity solutions that can prevent malware before it executes. Second, clarity in roles when it comes to cyber preparedness and response. And third, enhancing public-private collaboration to boost our collective cyber defense. When it comes to technology, the majority of today's cybersecurity solutions operate on the model of knowns, known malware, known attack techniques, and known attackers. These knowns are based on a collection of malware samples and indicators of compromise. Once these knowns are gathered, they are triaged, examined, and published into cloud repositories, and only after that are systems updated, tested, and tuned to defend against these known threats. This reactive model forces us to deal with the after effects of a cyber attack. We need to shift our focus from this incident response to incident prevention. And at BlackBerry, we know this can be done because in the last 90 days, we stopped more than 1.5 million malware-based cyber attacks, including more than 200,000 new malware samples before they had a chance to execute. And we did this by leveraging advanced AI and machine learning to continuously uncover and prevent attacks including ones that had never been seen before. Without prevention first, advanced AI-driven cyber solutions like these, Canada is constantly in reactive mode. Proactive defense also requires clear role definition and unity of effort. Today, cyber responsibilities in the federal government are distributed across at least 12 departments and agencies. Multiple ministers have cyber responsibilities. Yet, it is unclear who leads and who is responsible for ensuring coherence and unity of effort. When cybersecurity doesn't have a dedicated person pushing and fighting for the issue, it sits in the middle of everyone's priority list. Australia and the US tackled this issue head-on by appointing a cyber minister, or in the case of the US, a presidentially nominated and congressionally confirmed national cyber director. Canada should consider establishing a cabinet or other senior position responsible for ensuring government-wide coherence and action on cybersecurity. Finally, improving public-private collaboration on cybersecurity should be a priority. Companies like BlackBerry have unique insights and expertise to defend against adversaries, while federal agencies have the means and authorities to act. We should foster proactive collaboration between government and the private sector at the operational level. This would help close gaps in our situation awareness, foster incident response playbooks that are aligned, and help create a culture of proactive collaboration at scale. BlackBerry stands ready to work with the committee to strengthen Canada's cyber resilience, and I thank you for this opportunity today.
Thank you, Mr. DeBoer. Mr. McSorley, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, for the opportunity to speak with the committee today. The International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group is a Canadian coalition that serves as a watchdog around national security, anti-terrorism, and civil liberties in Canada. We have long-standing experience examining Canadian work regarding surveillance and cyber activities, including the work of the Communications Security Establishment. We agree that it is vital that Canada take steps to modernize cybersecurity laws to protect the private information of Canadians and the information infrastructure on which we rely. It is also clear that as cyber attacks increase in activity and sophistication, that Canada must take steps to defend itself. However, these actions must not come at the cost of accountability and transparency of government activities, including those of the CSE. In our work, we have seen how overly broad powers and extensive secrecy result in the violation of the rights of Canadians and people in Canada. This can have real-world impacts, including when the information of Canadians and people in Canada are shared internationally with the Five Eyes, as well as with other foreign agencies. In the hands of foreign jurisdictions, Canada loses control over how the information may be used, including in ways that can result in rights violations, abuse, and even torture. We also disagree with the premise that the private information of non-Canadians outside of Canada is simply fair game for mass collection and retention. This approach reinforces ongoing global systems of mass surveillance and associated rights violations. This was revealed in detail by Edward Snowden, and while it did lead to promises of reform within Canada, it is unclear to what degree the CSE's activities have truly changed. While much of these concerns are related to the CSE's signals intelligence work, they also apply to CSE's cybersecurity and cyber warfare activities. For example, while the CSE may have two distinct areas within its mandate, signals intelligence and cybersecurity and information assurance, they do not exist in a silo. Recently, the BC Civil Liberties Association published material obtained from disclosure in their lawsuit against the federal government regarding the CSE's operations. These documents revealed, for example, that under an agreement with the former Department of Foreign Affairs, information that CSE collected during its provision of cybersecurity support to the department, including the private communications of Canadians, could be shared with its Five Eye counterparts. While this agreement dates to 2012, this concern persists under the CSE Act adopted in 2019. Specifically, the National Security and Intelligence Review Agency, or NSIRA, noted in its 2021 annual report that the CSE Act explicitly allows for this kind of information sharing between the CSE's various mandates, including cybersecurity and foreign intelligence. NSIRA raised concerns that this sharing must be narrow and case by case, and that the CSE should obtain legal advice on compliance with the Privacy Act. The CSE disagreed. Why is this important? Bill C-26, currently being studied by Parliament, would formalize the CSC's role in ensuring the protection of cyber infrastructure and would see the CSC obtain information about the security of critical infrastructure. This means that a lot more information will flow to the CSC, including potentially private information relating to Canadians. Without adequate safeguards in place, both in the CSC Act and Bill C-26, information collected by the CSC, including relating to Canadians, could be used in unexpected ways and shared with unaccountable foreign partners. For more on this, I'd like to direct the committee to an open letter that we co-signed with several other civil society groups, as well as to a recent report from Citizen Lab entitled Cybersecurity Will Not Thrive in Darkness. And I can send those along to the committee afterwards as well. The CSC also has a troubling history of obfuscating the nature of its work and violating its mandate. For example, the CSC tracked the Wi-Fi connections of Canadians at major airports, despite not being allowed to conduct surveillance within Canada. It collected massive amounts of internet traffic through 200 internet backbone sites worldwide. Despite prohibition, it regularly collects Canadians' information and received it from foreign partners. And it violated Canadian law for 5 years by failing to minimize Canadian information shared with Five Eye partners. The CSC also resists fully complying with review and oversight. For example, the CSC refuses to grant NCIRA full access to records the agency needs to carry out its review function. Instead, the CSC requires NCIRA to submit a request, and CSC staff provides what they say are relevant documents. This approach, NCIRA wrote in its latest annual report, and I quote, undercuts NCIRA's authority to decide whether information relates to its reviews and contributes to significant delays in the provision of information to NCIRA. The Intelligence Commissioner has also raised concerns that CSC authorizations for both foreign intelligence and cybersecurity have not included information crucial to the approval process, particularly regarding the outcomes of previous authorized activities or explanations of specific activities based on fact. Finally, NCIRA has also raised the concerns that the CSC is not providing adequate information on the impact of active or defensive cyber operations, nor appropriately delineating between the two kinds of activities, despite each requiring a different approval process. I do have some recommendations, just very short ones, but I'll save those for possibly during the question period. Thank you very much.
If in fact you don't get them in during the question period, you certainly can submit them through the clerk. With that, we'll go to our 6-minute round, starting with Mr. Kelly.
Thank you. I'm going to start with Mr. DeBoer, but I might actually ask all three witnesses to comment on my question. I want to talk about the threat of what I guess I would think of as sort of corporate espionage or the vulnerabilities within the private sector to cybersecurity. There was an article recently that talked about how hackers can manipulate the temperature of a barn and wipe out livestock populations, or that the food chain and the food supply chain in Canada is particularly vulnerable to cyber attack. But so that goes well beyond, though, just the damage to a private corporation. This goes right to food security, things like that. So I'll maybe start with you and have each witness comment on the vulnerabilities within the private sector that affect national security.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. An excellent organization. The focus of cybersecurity up until now has been largely on what we call enterprise, right? IT systems. But one of the largest gaps that has emerged is a focus on operational technology. These are typically systems that control, for instance, electric grid, gas power turbines, industrial control systems and pipelines, et cetera. And a lot of these systems are now coming online. What we've witnessed in the U.S., for instance, related to the Colonial Pipeline attack, or even in Florida to the Oldsmar water system, these systems were not designed to be connected to the internet, and now, including farm equipment, et cetera, are now trying to enable optimization through connection to the internet. We noted, for instance, in the manufacturing sector over the past year, the number of attacks have risen by 2,000%. And, you know, the three sectors most targeted over the past year by cyber criminals has been healthcare, financial, and manufacturing. But manufacturing is rising the quickest. And why? Our assessment is that because of the supply chain vulnerabilities that we're seeing, because of the intrinsic link between economic security and national security, and the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, everything is intertwined, those are becoming increasing attack vectors.
Yeah.
I'll ask the other witnesses to comment as
Absolutely.
well and maybe have time for other questions. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Mr. Nareed?
Yes, thank you for your question. Let me say that cybercrime, right, consists, that is the term that we usually use to describe both industrial espionage and ordinary crime activities, is in fact the third largest economy in the world. Like by 2025, the damages resulting from cybercrime gonna amount to $15 trillion, right? And they grow by an amount of $1,500 billion a year. It is a huge problem, and the efforts from, let's say, the efforts conducted in this manner are not in pair with damages that are occurring and that they are growing. So taking it into account what the previous witness was talking about, that is attacks on critical infrastructure especially, which are in fact forbidden by a Geneva Convention because it's actually attacking civilian infrastructure, is growing daily. And we have to take state nation actors into account, especially Russia. This is what I was trying to enforce before, right? The Vulcan files. Before we were just speculating on their capabilities, but now we are certain and we have confirmation that they are collecting data all over the world. They are compromising systems, power plants, hydroelectric power plants, electric grids, civilian infrastructure from hospitals to everything else, collecting that, scanning systematically, collecting vulnerabilities in one huge giant database and preparing in a way for a black swan scenario. So what I'm really concerned about is that Western countries, NATO countries, are not protecting their infrastructure in the manner that they should be. It is a huge problem and it should be addressed promptly.
Thanks for the question. And just very briefly, it's clear that there's a role for the federal government in supporting private companies in increasing their cybersecurity and protecting national security. We think that one of the things that's key to this is that there's trust and transparency around that process so that private companies can trust what the government is going to be doing when they provide that support, and also among the public that there's trust and understanding around what those services are. And so we think that that needs to be a central component of legislation like C-26.
Not even just a quick moment. I want to ask something quite specific resulting from Mr. Nareed's testimony there.
But you're right on, bang on 6 minutes, and if I do, you know, the trouble is the whole thing just goes south on me if I let one went away. So I'm sorry, Pat. Yes.
To quantify that trillion-dollar, multi-trillion-dollar number.
Okay.
It is a shocking number, and I picked up on it as well. But Mr. May, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To Mr. DeBoer.
Ask it again.
To Mr. DeBoer. You noted in a 2021 post for the Canadian Chamber of Commerce that, quote, the OECD reports that Canada is one of the few countries where technology R&D investment is stagnant, investing only 1.5% of GDP and declining, while Canadians Canada's competitors are investing billions to improve their cybersecurity capabilities. In your opinion, sir, what are some of the factors that contribute to that underinvestment in R&D by the Canadian private sector?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Indeed, Canada, actually, that was in 2021, but the data remains the same today. We are laggards when it comes to R&D investment. Some of the key factors related to that, while we welcome, for instance, the renewal and revision of the SR&ED announced very recently, enterprises benefit much more from developing R&D outside of Canada, particularly multinational corporations, because there are much more collaborative support systems in place, whether it be with university-based research or elsewhere. Now, BlackBerry has made a commitment to invest in Canada. We invest about 24% of our annual revenue in R&D, working very closely with Canadian universities, et cetera. But not all companies are incentivized to do so. And so there really needs to be a concerted partnership between government and private sector, not across all the board, but betting in particular niche areas where Canada has a comparative advantage. And our post here was that cybersecurity is one of the areas where Canada has a comparative advantage. We rank 4th in the world in the number of cybersecurity companies, but we're not keeping up to pace with Israel, the UK, or the US, which is far ahead of us. Thank you.
So, can you maybe elaborate a little bit more and provide some recommendations on how can we take steps to ensure that IP grown in Canada, often with the help of direct or indirect public funding, stays in Canada?
So I think one of the key things here is commercialization. There's a lot of what we call lower TRL, or very initial stage R&D that takes place in Canada. But then after it passes this initial stage, it goes through something called the Valley of Death, which means it's very difficult to productize this R&D here in Canada. And there are very few programs, for instance, that support Canadian companies to help maybe launch initial products, to test them, to get them to market. While in the United States, for example, of course, U.S. government procurement budgets are much larger, but their procurement process is much more agile. They have systems in place to help that companies get through that valley of death, to help commercialize their products. And so, in terms of some of the suggestions we put forward with the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, was to establish a Canadian commercialization fund that would help Canadian companies move towards that productization. The Canadian Innovation Agency, which was announced in the 2022 budget, may be a start, but we yet have very much details about that. So we're hopeful that the whole commercialization question there, right, which will help commercialize products here in Canada, keep IP in Canada, would be a key aspect to that question.
We've heard a number of times there are concerns that electronic components manufactured by state-affiliated corporations in countries like China pose a cybersecurity risk in Canada. Should we be concerned about the cybersecurity risk posed by offshore manufacturing of IT equipment? BlackBerry, since it created devices, was very focused on ensuring that all of the components in those devices, including software, were what they said they were. We even developed software that helped us identify the provenance of each component. This is a huge concern. I mean, in the U.S., you have Executive Order 14028, which is about the nation's cybersecurity, which actually mandate what they call a software bill of materials, which would basically produce an ingredients list of all software contained in every device. Right now, if you ask people what software is in their system or in their device, very few people know about it. Part of the problem is also open source software, right? This is free software available on the internet that is used widely,
but where there are high security vulnerabilities. So I think one thing that Canada should consider, that many other countries in the EU and the US are considering, is making sure that there's a commitment to secure by design principles. You can't bolt on security afterwards.
Thank you. In my last 10 seconds, sir, I'm wondering if it's the will of the committee, if Mr. Nareed talked about information that he can't share in this forum. I'm wondering if I could request that he work with the clerk to find a potential solution for that.
I don't see why that's not a good idea. We'll leave it as an instruction. Thank you for that. With that, Madame Normandine, 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'd like to continue with you, Mr. De Boer, in your line of questioning from Mr. May. In your 3 priorities, you mentioned the importance of being well equipped to be able to act in a preventative rather than a reactive manner, and it would strike me that Canada is often reactive. As far as equipment and materials are concerned, could you please pinpoint what kind of priority investments there should be, AI-driven ones, cryptographics, and mapping? What would be the top priority as far as equipment is in order to be in a preventative mode? Thank you for the question.
What we can do immediately is to ensure that Department of National Defense, that our government, that our critical infrastructure are equipped with what we call the latest technologies. That is not the case right now. AI-driven technologies. Right now, there's 2 large problems. One, there are not enough cyber professionals in the world. There are more than 3 million vacant jobs globally. In Canada, probably around 200,000. And the Department of National Defense and these critical infrastructure agencies suffer with that as well. So you have to complement that with machines, right, with AI, because there's more than 400,000 new malware samples a day. So this is proven technology. BlackBerries, for instance, was developed in 2012. We're in our 7th generation. So that can be implemented. Ensure that in the procurement speculations, et cetera, that we are not including specs that tie us to previous generations of technology, signature-based. That's one. Number 2, we have to continually invest in R&D, as was mentioned previously, to ensure that we outpace our rivals. We're already seeing cyber criminals use ChatGPT and others for phishing attacks, right? We need to ensure that our AI is better than their AI when it comes to defending. So that's something that we can do immediately. Quantum cryptography, those technologies exist, but some of those issues we need to continually work on. But that is an endeavor that's ongoing. But I would suggest, let's use the technology we have now. Merci.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. You also spoke about the collaboration between the private and public sectors. I'd like to hear your input about that, and also, Mr. Nareed, about tripartite cooperation with ethical hackers. Is that possible? Mr. De Boer first, and then Mr. Nareed, please.
C'est une très bonne question.
That's an excellent question.
The reality right now is that a lot of public-private partnership or collaboration in Canada is, again, reactive. It's in the wake of an incident, right, or an indicator of vulnerability, and it's largely one way. We provide information to the government, disappears into a black hole. BlackBerry maintains good relationships with the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, et cetera, but that could be much more robust. What I would suggest, again, moving to a prevention-first approach, is let's plan before an incident. Let's develop, operational plans, contingency plans, mitigation plans, in terms that clarify roles and responsibilities when a critical infrastructure system is hacked, right? And in terms of working with hackers, absolutely, we work with white hackers, ethical hackers, right, to test vulnerabilities in systems, whether that be in automobiles or in other connected devices. They're a key part of our community. Not so sure about in Canada, but in some contexts, their ability to work cohort in collaboration with businesses and government is limited because there's the legal framework to enable that is not allowed. In the UK, for instance, they're currently considering changing that legal framework so there could be much more robust collaboration between white hackers, the good hackers, and government, etc. But it's a fantastic question. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Nadir.
Mr. Nadir? Or would you like to tack on to that, please? Nareed, rather, sorry.
Yes, thank you very much for your question. I think that collaboration with ethical hackers is crucial if we want to secure the Western nations. And for example, I would put a pilot, Pentagon's pilot bug bounty program as an example where they open up their systems on a bug bounty platform where ethical hackers could go test their systems and report their vulnerabilities. The result was that the systems got compromised. The first report came in, I believe, in first 7 minutes, and in first 6 hours there were like 200 to 300 reports. So that means 300 security vulnerabilities, 300 security holes that an adversary could exploit to gain access to their systems. And because of this collaboration, the Pentagon was more secured. And I believe that it was Mr. Ash Carter that complemented the effort, the initiative, and in a way concluded that they didn't realize how many good ethical hackers, how many good IT professionals there are that would like to help, but they don't have the opportunity to do so. And as the experience in Ukraine has shown, using crowdsourced intelligence, using crowdsourced efforts is the key in such environment, especially in cyber environment, to achieve desired results. Without it, I don't think it's even possible.
Thank you. Thank you, Madame Normandine. Ms. Matheson, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for appearing today. Mr. McSorley, I wanted to ask you, in this committee, we specifically have heard from, at the beginning, actually, of the study, we heard from Canadian intelligence agencies, CSE specifically, and they specifically said repeatedly that Canadian intelligence agencies don't target Canadians or collect data on Canadian activity, but that the BC Civil Liberties Association had a lawsuit, and one of their concluding arguments was, and I quote, "What was truly shocking is how hard CSE pushes up against the edge of legality and pushes back against even the most reasonable regulation and oversight." So could you comment on that in terms of how those intelligence agencies are constantly pushing against the legal boundaries that are Canadian law?
Thank you very much for the question. I think a lot is riding on that word target in what you were speaking about in terms of what the CSE presented to the committee. So it's true that the CSE, through its mandate and through the CSE Act, cannot target Canadians. But in collecting signals intelligence and in carrying out their work, including on cyber security and protecting cyber infrastructure, as I mentioned, they collect all kinds of information and then they sift through it. And so there's information that's known as unselected information. And so that is information that is not specifically the target, but they may accumulate in carrying out their collections, and then that information is retained. And some of that information may relate to Canadians. And that's where they came into problems, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of sharing Canadian information with the Five Eyes and with other countries. It isn't that they are targeting Canadians, there's that word targeting, but rather that they are incidentally collecting that information, but they still retain it, and it is still used in other ways. And so that's what we see when they're pushing up against the boundaries. That's what they do. There's another category of information of metadata. So metadata isn't the communications itself, it's all the information around the communication. So who sent the information, who received it, what time, from where, what kind of software was used, what kind of equipment. And there's a debate that's longstanding around whether or not metadata should be considered private information. But it's been clear that metadata, taken together, can paint a very clear picture of what individuals do and can lead to being able to identify certain individuals. And yet the CSC has consistently argued that that doesn't amount to private information. And so we have questions around, again, it's not targeting of Canadians, but collecting that kind of information. And the final thing I'll mention is around publicly available information. So despite every other restriction around the CSC's collection of information, they are allowed to collect publicly available information. And again, they're not allowed to collect information that has privacy impacts on Canadians. But there's still debate around what's considered private information or what maintains a reasonable expectation of privacy. So for example, information that we post on social media, there's an argument that that's publicly available information. It's an argument that has been made. But at the same time, are we expecting that to be collected and retained and possibly shared by our national security agencies? That was at the heart of the debate around Clearview AI, where they argued that facial images of Canadians online were considered publicly available information and they could collect it. The Privacy Commissioner ruled that that was mass surveillance and was illegal. When they brought that to the RCMP said they had no obligation to ensure that if they were working with Clearview AI, that they were following Canadian law. We don't know about the CSC's work on facial recognition technology, but if we can see that with the RCMP and that approach and that definition and the lack of clarity around publicly available information, we have to be worried that the CSC would be interpreting it the same way.
Thank you for that. Yes, it was mentioned. Oh, sorry, there's a lot of. There was mentioned within that same lawsuit in the documents that the BC Civil Liberties Association came out with that glossary of terms, that identification of unselective data, publicly available data and how it's used. Do laws like C-59, because that lawsuit that was before C-59, it was addressing more of the old Bill C-51 problems. But does Bill C-59, and I wanted to ask specifically again, as we look at Bill C-26, do those laws adequately address the threats that civil liberties are worried about in terms of that taking advantage of publicly available data?
That's a good question. You've got about 30 seconds to answer it. So
I'll just quickly say no. Several of the problems I raised were actually enshrined in Bill C-59, the creation of the CSC Act. And one of the things we think that needs to be done is to bolster the powers of both NCIRA and the Intelligence Commissioner to be able to review these kinds of activities and be able to discuss publicly their findings.
Okay, thank you. You actually was very efficient on your response. You'll get another 15 seconds, Ms. Matson. We're on the 5-minute round now, and Ms. Gallant.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And my questions will be for Mr. Nareed. I'm going to ask 3 quick questions, and then he can budget his time in answering them. Now, we just finished a study on the Arctic in this committee, and one of the recommendations, instead of getting submarines, is using drones under the ice in our Arctic. And we know that adversaries are currently transversing in submarines, and they have the data in real time. My question is there a vulnerability for a drone underwater ice drone in the Arctic in transmitting the data back to whomever as opposed to just being there in real time and seeing for yourself? So that's one, threats for under ice drones. 2 is, how is artificial intelligence impacting the cyber threat environment? And 3, how can security agencies or defense distinguish between a series of or simultaneous attacks on communications technology or industrial control systems? How can they tell if it is the precursor to a kinetic attack?
Mr. Nareed?
Thank you, Ms. Galland, for the questions. They're excellent ones. Regarding the drones, it's about the pinnacle of cybersecurity industry. That means it's about electronic warfare. And I've recently had discussions with people really tightly involved with the field, and it's an ongoing game of cat and mouse. It is not an answer that it's easily it's not a question that's easily answered, but there are technologies, but they are built more in the private sector, that where there are drones available that are quite electronic warfare resistant. And we had an opportunity to see some of them flying over Russian territory recently, and they continue to fly. It is more of an electronic warfare question, but the main point here is that all those units, electronic warfare units, are able to pass the signal, right? But they have the most crucial problem is how to transform that signal to zeros and ones, to put it plainly. And that's one of the biggest challenges that electronic warfare units of Five Eyes countries or NATO countries are currently experiencing, but they are working on that. Now, regarding how AI is impacting cyber threat environment, I would say that it is a double-edged sword, right? It can be used both for defensive and offensive means, as our co-witness has previously stated. ChatGPT, for example, and I hate to put it as an example, has become one of the largest producers of malware. I mean, it got hacked in less than a few days. And black hat hackers use it efficiently, not just to produce phishing emails and content related to that, but you can effectively use it to produce very sophisticated malware. It is very easy to bypass the restrictions put in place by OpenAI and basically make it do to write whatever code that someone would think of, including to attack SCADA systems, including to, let's say, duplicate Stuxnet worm, or however. It all depends just on the creativity of the person talking with it. Now, how to distinguish, let's say, precursory attacks towards something that would lead to kinetic attacks? I would say that every precursory attack is something that will lead to kinetic attack, especially in terms of Russia and their capabilities. I would again like to point out, just yesterday released information regarding the Vulcan files, which are very descriptive in terms of Russian cyber capabilities, and they actually prove that they have been systemically attacking Western infrastructure for years, attacking our infrastructure and attacking our industrial control systems, hospitals, and whatever information they can gather, they do gather, put in the database, and they simply wait for the right moment to strike. It is, as I've said, a black swan in the making, and we should start taking it very, very seriously.
Thank you, Mr. Nareed, Ms. Gallant. Mr. Souza, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for your presentation. So we have a concern, all of us do, in regards to the security measures in this country, as well as then the privacy and our sovereignty as a nation. And my first question is to Mr. DeBoer. When we look at the notion of IP and the commercialization of IP, the ownership, frankly, of the technologies that Canada seems to do well at advancing. In fact, Canada is a pretty good supplier of infrastructure and IT to other countries, and they themselves have noted we're lagging behind just by what they see happening in other jurisdictions. And I believe the Science and Research Committee are also looking at the commercialization of IP and how to get through that valley of death that you mentioned. The question then becomes who adjudicates some of these deals and how do we coordinate the private sector to facilitate that engagement with the academic sector? And then what role does government have to play in this? And you mentioned a couple of funds that were being proposed. So I'm still struggling, though, that the mindset that we have, and while it may seem reactive, it's also a means of necessity by which to come forward with new technology, new innovation, and then protect it with ownership of the IP and the patent so that others can't use it. How do you make others accountable to, and other countries for that matter, accountable for escalating some of this, right? Is there a real sense of, I mean, the Five Eyes are out there, but there are misbehaviors. How do you make them accountable?
So it's a complex question, obviously. A lot of it outside of my scope of expertise. But when it comes to protecting against, for instance, espionage, malicious behavior, right, that tries to either siphon off or sabotage IP and the entire R&D process, there are a couple of vulnerabilities I think that need to be filled immediately. One, companies like BlackBerry, but not just BlackBerry, work very closely with universities, research institutes, small, medium-sized businesses in Canada to create new products, new IP. Across that chain, that supply chain, the security assurances required are not always in place, right? We need to ensure that security is as important, guarding that IP as we develop it is as important as developing it itself. In essence, it should be considered to be a national asset. And so when it comes to universities, I do know that CSIS has done is starting to push forward programs to raise the awareness about security within university research labs themselves to safeguard IP. We need to do similarly with SMEs that work on that. And so if there's one recommendation I could make, I mean, the Insurance Bureau of Canada did a survey last year asking SMEs about whether they had invested in cybersecurity. 47% of them had invested $0 last year in cybersecurity. And we know that SMEs are critical to IP creation. We need to do something to incentivize these SMEs to protect their IP. And they're not investing in it largely, apparently, because of the cost, right? It's a trade-off. And so I think, as a government, as a society, we need to shift the lens to start incentivizing security to be part of that. And the last thing I'll mention is, ISED 2 years ago rolled out a fantastic program in theory called the Canadian Digital Adoption Plan. The idea there was to increase the use of digital technologies by small, medium-sized businesses. Cybersecurity was not included in that initially. We worked with ISED later to include that in the assessment. But these kinds of programs need to embed cyber as a fundamental core of their operations.
Thank you, Mr. Sousa. You have 8 seconds left, and you're not going to get them.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Yeah. Madame Normandine, 2.5 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask a question of Mr. McSorley now. You spoke about a number of situations, including the CST, the protection of privacy and personal information. I don't know anything about this. How do you get that information about CSE activities, Wi-Fi, monitoring of connections in airports? Is that made public by the CSE, Communication Security Establishment, or how do you go about collecting that information? Thank you very much for the excellent question.
There's multiple ways that we collect that kind of information. So some of it is before the creation of the Intelligence Commissioner, there was the CSC Commissioner who initiated reviews. So it's the independent review and oversight bodies that often have access to this information and will share that information when, although still redacted in a way that protects national security when there are concerns. Sometimes those are even still difficult to interpret because of redactions and kind of euphemisms and language. Often it relies on access to information requests. Researchers, a lot of academic researchers and our own research, requesting documents, digging in and trying to find information. In terms of the issue around Wi-Fi at the airports, that was based on both the commissioner and also journalists who discovered the information and publicized it.
Yeah.
And then, you know, one of the things that I based my...
Excuse me, Charles, can you turn off your microphone, please? I think it's you anyways. Okay, continue.
Thank you. And one of the reasons that I have access to information that I have today is because of the BC Civil Liberties Association's lawsuit that resulted in disclosure that they then had to fight to be able to share the information that they obtained publicly and only recently were able to publish that publicly. And I guess what ties that all together is that the information isn't coming from the CSC itself. It's coming from external bodies, from researchers, from review committees, and from lawsuits. And it shouldn't have to be that way.
Et justement, j'aimerais...
And on that point, you talked about the importance of accountability and transparency. Do you have any recommendations to make to have enhanced accountability and transparency?
One of the things that we've seen is that both in terms of the Intelligence Commissioner and in CIRA, that they're not receiving the information they require in order to do their review work. And in the case of the Intelligence Commissioner, their oversight work. So we think that there needs to be amendments made to the CSC Act that make authorizations for their various activities contingent on providing adequate and appropriate information to the Intelligence Commissioner, as well as providing the Intelligence Commissioner with the power to make binding amendments to the authorizations that the CSC is seeking.
Okay, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. It seems like every time we get into your recommendations, I have to cut you off. So I'm sure we'll get it out by the course of the hour. Ms. Matheson, 2 minutes and 45 seconds.
Woohoo.
Yeah.
Fancy. So with that extra 15 seconds, I'll just say to Mr. McSorley, for all of those recommendations, I hope that you please do submit them to the clerk so that we can have that as part of our record and part of our study. I wanted to ask, within this committee, a lot of witnesses have talked about intelligence silos and Canadian intelligence agencies needing to integrate more for better intelligence sharing. But there are concerns when you get into, for example, CRA sharing with CSIS or sharing with CSE, that we have seen discrimination play a role in investigations of Muslim charitable organizations, for example. Mr. McSorley, could you speak to the dangers that are posed by that further integration and what we can do to avoid taking it too far in terms of that discrimination and victimization of some organizations that are quite legitimate?
Thank you very much for that question. So first, it's clear, as you said, that there is need for collaboration between national security agencies, and some of that does require the sharing of information. However, as you pointed out, what we have seen is that there are deep concerns around how some of that information is shared and what its impact can have. So, for example, again, in the BC Civil Liberties Association's research, they found that the CSC was sharing evidence with, not evidence, but intelligence with the CRA regarding, in order to bolster their efforts to counter terrorist financing. However, what we have found in our research is that the CRA, through their efforts to counter terrorist financing, has taken a prejudiced approach to Muslim charities in Canada and has been operating from an idea that because there are terrorist threats from Muslim-linked organizations, that the Muslim community must be placed under greater suspicion, and that results in greater surveillance, greater information gathering and sharing, and greater repercussions as compared to other communities in Canada. How this ties back to the study at hand is that the information, the intelligence that is shared isn't known publicly to the organization that's being used against, so they don't have the opportunity to challenge that. And we see that also reflected in, for example, C26, where there's, we believe, an undue amount of secrecy and ability to use information and to hide information from critical infrastructure companies that are providing telecommunication services to Canadians if they were to, for example, attempt to appeal or challenge an order made by the minister.
Okay,
And so,
unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, Mr. McSorley, again. Madame Diamond, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you and good morning. I'd like to pose my questions to Mr. Nareed this morning. A briefing document your organization provided to a previous House committee indicated that concerns raised by other observers were still valid. In fact, the organization specifically pointed to an article written by Alexander Rudolph, who appeared before this committee earlier this year. And in that, he said, Canada needs both a whole-of-government cybersecurity response and a very targeted cyber defense response. In addition to that, in a document provided to committee last year, it's quoted that the author wishes to reiterate that the CAF is not ready to meet even moderate cyber threats, such as hacktivists, and taking into account publicly available information and emerging threats, it won't be ready to meet modern cyber challenges for the foreseeable time. Could you possibly expand on that, and do you still share this view? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Yes, I still share that view because I think that I have. It's been a year since that document, but I believe that I wrote that the basic problem is that the threat environment was specified solely to where the Canadian Armed Forces are stationed, right at home in Canada and abroad. And that is a failure in understanding the cybersecurity environment in general. There is no defense perimeter anymore, right? Not just Canadian Armed Forces and their members, but also their family members are a target for a moderate attacker. A black hat hacker, or especially some sort of let's say a Russian group as a sandworm. They will not attack specifically hard and secure targets, but they will go after so-called low-hanging fruits first. That means even attacking family members, for example, compromising their home networks and expanding from that point onwards. We had a similar case in Slovenia where our emergency response was taken down by the very same manner. And it was a failure in strategic thinking. I'm not familiar on if that agenda has changed in the past year, but if it hasn't, it should be updated and improved. I hope that answers your question.
It does, certainly, and leads me into my next question. You've also been quoted as saying that the genie is out of the bottle in terms of cyber warfare, and that the cyber World War III is already in full swing. My question is, many observers have pointed out that there's a significant cyber skills gap in our civilian sector. Could you expand and share with the committee what it means for the Canadian Armed Forces that is currently facing a recruitment and retention crisis in its very nascent cyber operations division? Thank you.
Well, thank you for your question. As Ukrainian experience has shown, let me put in an example, right? A war cannot be won without the support of native population. I think that is some term that quite sticks. And it is the same in cybersecurity sphere, right? Especially the Western countries, the Americas, kind of relies on its water, right, for defense and on overspending for defense also. But that is not the concept that you can rely on in terms of cyber warfare. So relying on crowdsourced intelligence to utilizing everyone that can help is the way to go, in my opinion. So organizing initiatives and taking into account that just by keeping it closed, a closed loop, it won't solve any problems.
Thank you. And could I leave you with the rest of your time to
And if
go ahead?
yes, if I may, I would also just take a minute to explain the cyber damages I was talking before, because it's kind of relating to the subject. Just for example, the F-35 program, right, which cost $1.7 trillion to develop in terms of R&D, got hacked by Chinese, and all the plans got stolen. So, and that is just one hack. Now, if we combine everything that together, we get a clearer picture on where the damages are coming from, and that relates both to the Army, to the Air Force, to basically every part of modern society.
Okay, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Rather unfortunate point at which to leave it. Ms. O'Connell, 5 minutes.
So much. Thank you to all our witnesses for being here today. Mr. DeBoer, I wanted to ask about, you've spoken about mandatory reporting and things like that, but I also want to dive into a little bit of some of the challenges we've heard in other testimony as well about private sector not necessarily wanting to share if they've been hacked or if their systems are vulnerable. And I could certainly see, for example, of BlackBerry that has a reputation for security. If there was ever a breach, it may not be in the board or the governance of the company to want to necessarily promote that a breach happened or an attack was successful. So how does government partner to understand the real world picture in the private sector, but keeping in mind that the private sector might not be interested in sharing this information?
Thank you for that question. Trust is really important there. That the information that any company will give over to the government will be treated in a confidential way, right? Liability protections, all of these things need to be taken into consideration. And currently, that trust has yet to be built fully. One way to get there is, for instance, what the UK or the US is doing, which is to build a joint collaborative environment or a joint, cyber defense collaborative, where there is actually, before an incident happens, channels of communication for information exchange, threat information exchange are shared on a voluntary basis oftentimes, where private sector actually gets better understanding of how the information that they give actually is used, flows, and it becomes a true partnership between the private and public sector. Right now, I think the situation is one where there is some hesitancy, right, for regulators, et cetera, to engage. But I think we all recognize that closer public-private partnership is essential.
Thank you. So that clarification is important, because when I hear mandatory reporting, I don't necessarily think that that's confidential. You might, and we've had other testimony that it would be public mandatory reporting so that Canadians have a broader sense. But I think that distinction, at least from that perspective, is interesting. There's also I think a significant onus on individuals or individual corporations to safeguard their security. And you mentioned in your testimony that your organization had a policy of knowing where every component of the product, let's say, comes from. But in examples where companies might have boards and directors and shareholders, where cost effectiveness, that might not be the case. So what would your recommendation be to ensure that the public is more aware of the what they're purchasing, the onus on them, and then what can government do to encourage private sector to not always just look at the bottom line, but the cybersecurity piece?
So, a huge driver of security, particularly in the automotive sector, has been an emphasis on safety, right? And when consumers start demanding safety or security, that changes. I spoke earlier about a software bill of materials or ingredients list. When we buy things at the grocery store, you know exactly there is an ingredients list there listed, right? There could be, and there's discussion in multiple jurisdictions about, for instance, a cyber safety rating for IoT devices, right? Whether they be your fridge or elsewhere, that could be considered. More awareness about the whether this product is safer than the other could be something for public consumption considered. And I think those are important steps, not just to raise awareness, but to also entice producers to build in security up front, because that's not happening.
Okay, thanks.
Colleagues, I need some guidance here. We've run over our hour. First of all, I turn to the clerk and find out, do we know the arrival of our friends? We don't. Okay. I have some committee business that I'd like to do in camera. And we don't know, and we had anticipated that our friends would arrive at 10:15. That gives us 20 minutes, and it does take a few minutes to go in camera. My thought is, because this is such an excellent panel, that we do a kind of like a 2-minute lightning round each party, and just there's stuff that could get out. Is that an acceptable idea? 2 minutes? Okay. So, going now, and I'll Conservatives, Liberals, Bloc, and NDP, and then we'll call it regardless. Okay? 2 minutes.
Before you start my clock, I just want to give notice of the following motion, that the committee undertake a study of no less than 8 meetings to review how the readiness of the Canadian Armed Forces is impacted by Canada's procurement processes and the capabilities of our defence industry to ensure that the Canadian military needs are being met, and that the Department of National Defence, Canadian Armed Forces, Public Services and Procurement Canada, Office of the Auditor General, Parliamentary Budget Officer, Treasury Board, Defence Industry, military procurement experts, and academics be invited to testify before committee on this matter, and that the committee report its findings and recommendations to the House. And we have that in both official languages, and we'll circulate. If I can start my lightning round of questions. So first of all, I just want to thank all the witnesses for being here, and just want to. The government has proposed Bill C-26 as a way to encourage industry to have stronger cybersecurity defense, and there's been a lot of concerns raised that the fines and penalties are overly prescriptive and brutal in finding individuals and companies, but yet that same type of types of fines and penalties aren't applied to the government itself. And so I'd like to get feedback from Mr. DeBoer, in particular, being a Canadian industry here. And I do miss my BlackBerry phone from back in the day. But I would just ask, who's responsible? Is it Canadian Armed Forces, Department of National Defence, CSC, Government of Canada as a whole in protecting critical infrastructure, including in the private sector? Or is that best to come from the individual companies? And if you also can touch on the issue around available people, because based upon the Business Council of Canada, they say that we have 25,000 unfilled positions currently in the cybersecurity world.
In a little less than a minute.
So who is responsible? It's unclear. I mean, that was part of my testimony is we need to clarify roles and responsibility. And that doesn't exist right now. We don't have a unity of effort. When it comes to C26, it's an important start. We are late to the game when it comes to mandatory reporting in critical infrastructure on cyber incidents. So we welcome that initiative, but it's limited to 4 sectors, right? And the reality is there's a lot of policy action happening right now. The critical infrastructure strategy is being renewed. It was drafted in 2009. Cyber isn't even mentioned, right? And then we've got the National Cyber Strategy, Bill C-26. All of these need to be united.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Bazan. Who's speaking for the Liberals? Mr. Fisher, 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, folks, for being here. I appreciate your testimony today. I've asked this question previously. I'm just interested in your thoughts on this. How can Canada better partner with the private sector to raise the cybersecurity bar across the country? Now, yesterday I read a story about in the CBC about Halifax Water, and there was a test of their cybersecurity. Emails were sent to 55 people. 45 of them responded, clicked a link, and sent all of their information. We talk about mandatory reporting. We talk about the importance of critical infrastructure. When we think about that infrastructure, Halifax Water, or we think about public utilities across our country, as it pertains to mandatory reporting, as it pertains to sharpening their cybersecurity pencils. Interested in your thoughts. We'll start with you, Mr. DeBoer, and maybe move to Mr. McSorley in the short time we have. Thank you.
So very quickly, AI-driven cybersecurity tools. If that would have been used in the Colonial Pipeline, our 2015 model would have stopped it. So use advanced technology, and they can help in the personnel issue, but also protect critical infrastructure.
Thank you. I'll mention another bill here. Currently, the government is looking at the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, and so I think if we are, I agree with Mr. DeBoer that we need to be looking at innovative solutions, including AI, but we also need to make sure that we have regulations in place, and there's wide concerns, both private sector and civil society, that there are problems with what's contained in the AI and Data Act right now.
Ms. Normandin, 2 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Like Mr. Bezan's question, for you, Mr. DeBoer, you said that in the United States or in Australia there are cyber ministers, and Christian Luprick, a witness, told us that Denmark has cyber ambassadors. What kind of position could we envisage here? Do you have recommendations? What characteristics could such a position entail?
So the primary role of such an individual, it could be a parliamentary secretary, would first of all just signal to all Canadians that cybersecurity is important. Second, it would be one individual empowered with ensuring policy coherence and program coherence across Canada, right? Currently, that does not exist. And, I mentioned the Australian case, but the UK also has a parliamentary secretary responsible for cybersecurity. We used to have a parliamentary secretary for digital, right? That is no longer the case. So I think, the role would be to look across the Government of Canada to ensure coherence, unity of effort, and to unify our approach to defending the country.
Inaudible?
I think, we do need a centralized office to engage with cybersecurity. One of the questions we have around C-26 is it's not clear whether this would fall under existing national security review bodies. And so having an agency that's both tasked with ensuring that cybersecurity is handled properly, but also that is tasked with ensuring that it's reviewed and accountable and that there's transparency around it would be important as well.
Thank you. Ms. Masson, final 2 minutes.
Yes. So in this committee, we've heard a lot about the over-classification of information that Canadians classify 90% of what they, or 90% is what is not needed to be classified. So, Mr. McSorley, in terms of that overclassification of intelligence, how does that create a barrier or problems for civil rights organizations to hold the community that those intelligence agencies truly accountable? And what is your solution to that?
Thank you very much for the question. I'd say that it isn't just a concern among civil liberties and civil society groups, but across many sectors in Canada, that there needs to be a trust developed, that there needs to be openness and transparency to the degree where we understand what Canadian agencies, including the CSC, are engaging in when they engage in protecting Canada's cyber security, when they engage in active and defensive cyber operations, and when they engage in signals intelligence. The way to ensure that that's happening is to have greater mandatory reporting around the activities that they're carrying out. So, for example, there's a lack of mandatory reporting in C26 right now. So it would be very difficult to track ways that it's used, but also whether or not there's any failings so that we can improve the system. Oversight and review isn't simply about putting organizations on the defensive and calling them out, but also seeing where we can learn from our errors and improve the operations. And so, there's right now the Intelligence Commissioner and then NCIRA, and as I mentioned, it's not clear that they have a role in reviewing Canada's cybersecurity operations because they touch on national security, but not necessarily in the way that those bodies always review it. So we think there either needs to be a new position or amendments made to their mandate so it clarifies that they do have that mandate.
Thank you, Ms. Madison. Mr. Nareed, I saw that you had your hand up there. It's disadvantageous to be virtual when everyone else is physically present. So let me give you a minute or two to comment on
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll be very quick. Just an idea on how to quickly improve cybersecurity is to make the IT industry, right, the whole IT industry accountable. That means software and hardware vendors, because right now they have quite a unique status among all other industries. For example, if you would have a car that where brakes were malfunctioning or anything like that, right, they would be held accountable. But in terms of IT industry, such scenarios just don't come into account ever. They are not, and they should be. They should not just put products that are not market ready and that are insecure onto the market and endanger all of us from that, right? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Nareed. And I want to thank all the witnesses. It seems to me sitting here that we could have carried this conversation on for the rest of the day quite easily. And I personally, and then on behalf of the committee, want to thank you for your presence. This is an extraordinarily difficult subject to grasp, particularly those of us who are not into it on a daily basis and don't necessarily understand the nuances. So with that, thank you. We'll suspend and go in camera and continue on with committee business. Again, I thank you. And Mr. McSorley, if you didn't get all of your recommendations in, please coordinate with the clerk. And Mr. Nareed, I think the clerk will reach out to you at a further date. Thank you again.
Thank you.